我们要坚定不移发展全球自由贸易和投资。
China's Belt and Road Initiative is the most expensive infrastructure project in history.
China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and we think that there's a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world.
Belt and Road Initiative, a boom, a bust, or just a buzzword?
China is building a new Silk Road, looking to connect the world with its Belt and Road Initiative, which would allow them to solidify themselves in this changing multipolar political landscape as the world's dominant trade hub. China is quick to tout the benefits of the program, and its progress so far is impressive. But is it all it's cracked up to be? Do the critics have a point? Let's find out. But before we do, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our channel sponsor, Aura. Let me show you something real quick. Google your name. Odds are some of your personal information comes up, right? If I search my name, it's just my public social media accounts. Want to know why? Because I use Aura, the sponsor of today's video. If you've ever wondered why you're constantly harassed by spam calls, texts, and emails, here's why. There are companies called data brokers whose sole purpose is to find and sell your data. They do it without your consent, and they make billions selling it to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers. And while they're legally required to remove your info if you ask, they make the process confusing and difficult on purpose. This is why I'm always recommending Aura to family and friends. They take care of everything for you. They remove your data from these sites, and they keep it removed. Aura is an all-in-one digital security tool. You may already use some other basic app, but not using Aura is like locking the front door, but leaving the back door wide open. And Aura doesn't just fight data brokers. They alert you if your personal data is found on the dark web, they provide real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 identity theft monitoring, secure VPN, antivirus, parental controls, password manager, credit checker, and more. And if somehow something does happen, Aura includes $5 million in identity theft insurance, and they have US-based fraud experts on call 24/7. If you're anything like me, I'm sure you're sick and tired of these stupid, evil little companies stealing your personal information and using it to make a quick buck. That's why I use Aura. It keeps me and my family safe online. If you're ready to protect your data, you can get 2 weeks absolutely free when you use our link. During those 2 weeks, you'll see exactly where your data is being leaked and who's doing it. Give it a try. I promise you'll appreciate the peace of mind. Now, back to the show. The story of the BRI begins in 1976, when China partnered with Tanzania and Zambia to build the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. This was an 1,860-kilometer one-track line built with an interest-free loan from China. The line helped turn towns like Mbeya from remote outposts into regional trade hubs, and as of 2022 has moved 30 million tons of cargo and 40 million passengers. Benedict Mkanyago, a Tanzanian station chief, started as a laborer in the 1970s, trained by Chinese workers, and later became manager, a career opportunity he credits to the railway. Former Tanzanian Minister Mark Mwandozia echoed the sentiment, saying, "Those of us who saw the railway's construction will forever be grateful to China." A good start, no doubt, but that's just one project from almost 50 years ago. And technically, it wasn't part of the BRI, because the BRI didn't exist yet. But it was a good proof of concept, and shows that China has been interested in these South-South partnerships for decades. It wouldn't be until 2013 that Xi Jinping, who that year became General Secretary of the CPC and President of China, announced the BRI, which also goes by One Belt, One Road and New Silk Road, in Kazakhstan. Its 5 key objectives are policy coordination, connectivity, seamless trade, financial integration, and fostering strong people-to-people bonds. Over the years, the focus has shifted heavily towards developments that are high quality and green. In 2017, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment published the Guidance on Promoting Green Belt and Road, emphasizing the importance of ecological civilization and green development concepts. At time of writing, the BRI has launched over 200 projects, built 30,000 kilometers of highways, 2,000 kilometers of railways, and established ports that handle 85 million tons of cargo per year. That's the big picture. But let's look at the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway as an example of a successful BRI project in order to gauge what the ideal outcome is. This is a 752-kilometer electric rail line. Pretty simple, but it's had a huge impact. The railway cut freight times from 3 days to 20 hours, and is now a lifeline for essentials like grain and medical supplies for landlocked Ethiopia. The project also focused on hiring locals, the people these projects are meant to benefit. Over 90% of its 4,000 workers are local hires. This local focus is important, and this example is what other BRI projects strive for: building useful, important infrastructure that improves the economy and creates good, long-term jobs filled mostly by the people that live there. But of course, the BRI isn't entirely altruistic. China gets plenty in return. The current model swaps infrastructure for resources and/or other less tangible things like soft power and preferred access to resources in the future. The BRI's infrastructure doubles as geopolitical leverage. Kenya's SGR, which boosted GDP by 1.5 percentage points, also positions China as a counterweight to Western influence. Now let's take a look at some other projects to see how they measure up to the standard China has set for them. We'll start with Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR, a 485-kilometer artery connecting Mombasa to Nairobi. Since its launch, freight transported via the SGR surged to 1.7 million metric tons in 2023, while passenger numbers jumped by 13.9%, carrying over 700,000 people in a single quarter. Suffice to say, the effect on the economy was tremendous. Tanzania's Bagamoyo port, funded with an initial $9.5 million equivalent allocation, aims to handle ships requiring 17-meter depths, tripling the capacity of Dar es Salaam's port. When completed, it could even service landlocked neighbors like Rwanda and Uganda, turning Tanzania into a regional trade nexus. In 2018, Nigeria inked 175 construction contracts worth $17 billion in Chinese construction, which created over 11,000 jobs in China and profits for those companies. Meanwhile, Angola strikes oil for railway deals, which makes for a more straightforward exchange. Ports like Mombasa, upgraded under the BRI, now handle 85 million tons of cargo annually, while Ethiopia's railway generated $9 to $10 million in monthly revenue in 2021. But these projects often prioritize Chinese firms. For example, 90% of the Ethiopia-Djibouti railway staff are African, but critical management roles remain with Chinese contractors. Now let's head to Cameroon and take a look at their Kribi deep-sea port, strategically positioned in the Gulf of Guinea. Phase 1, built by China Harbor Engineering Company, transformed Kribi into a regional hub, and Phase 2 promises to make it Central and West Africa's largest container transit port. Nearby, the 1,600-kilometer Cameroon-Congo road, nicknamed the Road of Regional Integration, links Yaoundé to Brazzaville, which removes burdensome trade barriers. Merchants like James Esomba in Cameroon's border town of Ntam report a remarkable increase in cross-border commerce since its completion. The CCR has enabled Cameroon and Congo to trade directly. Before, they had to go through other countries, limiting profits for the involved parties due to complex shipping regulations. The reduction in complexity alone has proven to be a game changer, to say nothing of increased trade volume and reduced costs. Kenya's SGR increased trade so much that it alone added 2% to national GDP. Even tourism surged, as evidenced by the visitor arrivals at Kenya's airports spiking by 27.5% and 95.6%, partly due to BRI-linked infrastructure supporting events like the Africa Climate Summit. Industrial growth followed suit. Cement production in Kenya rose 6.8% in 2023, driven by demand for 2.5 million metric tons of cement to fuel rail and port projects. But the BRI's most tangible benefit, after the infrastructure, is unquestionably the jobs. After all, the new infrastructure needs upkeep and repair. They need people to drive the trains and move cargo. In Mozambique, the Maputo-Katembe Bridge employed 3,800 locals, with Chinese firms training over 5,500 workers in critically needed skills like welding and machinery operation. Solonge Monica Zungliza, a Mozambican employee, credits CRBC for funding her education, saying, "It has always given me any financial support I need." Cameroon's Memveele hydroelectric dam, generating 211 megawatts, enough to power thousands of homes, is projected to supply electricity across 6 Central African nations. Meanwhile, a Chinese-built water treatment plant now delivers 10,000 cubic meters daily, ensuring round-the-clock access to clean water for 9 cities. It's important to note that African nations aren't passive recipients of some foreign handout. Cameroon's Prime Minister, Joseph Dion Ngute, bluntly rejected external criticism of BRI partnerships, saying, quote, "We have a country we have to develop. That is our responsibility. Policy alignment is key. All 6 countries of the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, or CEMAC, have integrated the BRI into national strategies as a model for socio-economic transformation. Technical collaboration is part of this too. A good example is Mozambique's Maputo Bridge, which blended Chinese engineering with German oversight, a hybrid model that ensured compliance with local and European standards. They also opened workshops to train African students in technical skills, and provided scholarships that enabled over 10,000 students to study in China annually. This pragmatism extends to debt management. When Tanzania faced protests over the displacement of 2,000 residents for the Bagamoyo port project, it halted construction in 2016. A move that shows African agency and Chinese flexibility in balancing development and social equity. Uganda similarly paused the Kampala-Entebbe Expressway after opposition parties raised concerns about Kenya's $50 billion in external debt, 72% of which was owed to China. The BRI's flexibility contrasts sharply with Western aid's conditionalities. While institutions like the IMF mandate austerity, the BRI combines grants, low-interest loans, and joint ventures which aim to be fair but are definitely not perfect. This difference resonates in Africa. 52 nations and the AU have signed BRI agreements, leveraging them to fill $2.5 trillion in infrastructure gaps. As Elvis Ngole, a Cameroonian official, put it, "This is cooperation, not charity." By prioritizing infrastructure as a lever for diplomacy, not extraction, the BRI offers a model that aligns with Africa's demand for agency to control its modernization journey. The BRI sells itself as distinct from Western models entirely. Unlike EU free trade deals, which are rightly accused of enforcing subordinate economic status, China claims to have a no-strings-attached partnership policy. Colonial-era railways, like Nigeria's, were built to extract resources, while BRI projects like Kenya's SGR include wildlife-friendly overpasses and hired hundreds of local subcontractors. But reality doesn't always completely match the claims. Algeria's workers only earn €117, or about $128 per month, and Tunisia exports raw minerals to China, worth $72.3 million in 2017. The BRI's impressive 46,000 Kenyan jobs and Mbeya's revival coexist with Algeria's 75% unemployed graduates and Tunisia's gutted textiles. The BRI's 30,000 kilometers of highways and $1.5 billion railways coexist with $1.5 billion in smuggled goods and Moroccan factories closed by Chinese competition. Tunisia loses $500 million yearly to customs leaks. The Dar es Salaam consensus urges independence and fair markets, but the Tanzania-Zambia railway still relies on Chinese management. Even wildlife-friendly designs and countless local subcontractors can't mask the paradox. Progress with uneven gains. Still, Afrobarometer surveys note growing African preference for China's countermodel to Western aid. The US's counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa hinges on private-public partnerships, a US-EU-funded railway framed as a developmental alternative. Then-President Joe Biden's 2024 Angola visit spotlighted this, branding it as a, quote, renewed commitment. But commitment to whom? Let's look at the G7's Build Back Better World, or B3W, to see. The program touts climate action and gender equity, but its reliance on private capital and rigid debt standards sidelines the low-income nations it claims to uplift. For countries needing roads, ports, and power grids, not just vague, values-driven ideals, this mismatch is glaring. As one Angolan official put it, "We don't want patrons, we want partners." The Lobito Corridor exemplifies this. It's narrowly designed to export minerals like cobalt from Angola's interior, entrenching it as a subordinate, dependent raw material supplier. A far cry from the BRI's North-South Highway project in Angola, which prioritizes domestic trade integration. Even Washington's Panama Canal port gambit, aimed at dislodging Chinese operators, framed the move as, quote, critical to protecting US security, as opposed to local prosperity. Western aid has long been known as a trap. Structural adjustment programs, IMF-mandated austerity politics that slash public spending in exchange for loans, gutted African industries, dramatically shrinking the continent's share of global manufacturing. Today's US projects are just repeating the same extractive legacy of their colonial forebears. The Blue Dot Network, a US-led infrastructure certification scheme, demands market-driven financing benchmarks many African states can't meet, which the US knows, effectively excluding them from being able to develop their countries and economies. Meanwhile, with the BRI under China's guidance, $134 billion of infrastructure as of 2021 has built 78 ports and railways linking 16 landlocked nations to global trade routes, assets that generate $13 in trade for every $1 invested. China's BRI creates infrastructure that allows different sectors of the economy to interact. Take the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway. It doesn't just connect Ethiopia to the sea, it anchored industrial parks that boosted local manufacturing, a lifeline for a continent where factory output stagnated at 10% of GDP for decades. Compare this to US efforts like the Indo-Pacific Trilateral Infrastructure Forum, which focuses on countering BRI through private sector coalitions, leaving gaping holes in addressing Africa's $100 billion annual infrastructure deficit since infrastructure itself isn't profitable, especially in the short term. Overall, the data is pretty clear. 78 Chinese-operated ports dot Africa's coastline, slashing cargo costs by 40% in hubs like Nigeria's Lekki port, a stark contrast to US reluctance to fund large-scale public works. The BRI's focus on lower middle and low-income nations, that's 42 out of 53 African partners, targets those ignored by traditional lenders, while B3W's emphasis on digital innovation skips over basics like electricity for 600 million Africans. One builds vital connective tissue, the other builds elaborate, lucrative conveyor belts. Scale is another consideration. The BRI's 29,000-plus global projects dwarf the US's Development Finance Corporation, capped at $60 billion worldwide, which to many African nations shows a lack of commitment. As nations grow reliant on Chinese trade corridors, projected to tap into a $6.7 trillion African market by 2030, they are increasingly resisting Western pressure to shun Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative has reshaped Africa's development, but it faces challenges and valid criticism. For example, the debt. 19 countries, including Kenya and Pakistan, saw BRI engagement vanish entirely in 2023. In Pakistan alone, flagship projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor tanked by 74%. That doesn't align with any of the program's 5 goals, and China would be best served by forgiving those debts. What's more, China's 2021 promise to quit coal appears to be at odds with them breaking ground on a new 300-megawatt coal plant in Pakistan's Gwadar. But it follows the logic that coal is a necessary catalyst to its own obsolescence. At the same time, BRI mining deals ballooned to $19.4 billion, up 158% in a year, to lock down lithium and cobalt for tech. And with China controlling 80% of the world's graphite and half its lithium processing, the BRI is cornering the market on the future of tech. So, is the BRI perfect? Hardly. Debt lingers, as does coal, and ports sometimes stumble. But as long as Western aid is just austerity charity, the BRI's messy experiment is scripting a new playbook. China's highways, railways, and ports, moving millions of tons of cargo and boosting GDP across the continent, have redefined African development, even as debt and resource bargains draw scrutiny, both disingenuous and deserved. The US, fixated on extraction and private capital, struggles to match the BRI's scale, long-term vision, or pragmatism. It risks being remembered not for what it built, but what it couldn't imagine, while China will build the future of the collective imagination of collaborative nations around the world.